So now, the topic of this month is on board development. Do you have a board? Do you need a board? Does your board run perfectly? How do you set up a board if you don't have one? Things that I am not an expert on, but that's why we have these panelists of experts. So, joining us this morning, there's no possible way I could have memorized all the board experience that these three guys have. So we're privileged to have with us these guys with a wealth of board experience to lead our discussion. First of all, Mr. Jim Buus. Jim is the president of Goldmark Commercial Real Estate. He currently holds a seat at NDSU Research and Development Park, Dakota Venture Group, the Greater Fargo-Moorhead Economic Development Corporation, City of Fargo Tax Exempt Review Committee, and the Cotton Lake Foundation. He's previously been involved with Atlas Group Advisory Board, Lake Agassiz Exchange Club, Dakota Territory Exchange, and the Cotton Lake Association. Did I get them all? Pretty close? Yeah. And Mr. Eric Monson is the CEO of Ann Carlson Center. Eric has been on National Healthcare Productivity Company boards, Federal Credit Union Board, several nonprofit hospital boards, nonprofit nursing home boards, intellectual and developmental disabilities boards, and a regional foundation. So we're honored to have Mr. Monson with us here this morning. And Mr. Bob Sinner, seated up front here. Bob is the president at SB&B Foods, located in Castleton. Bob is currently on United Soybean Board, Northern Crops Institute, the North Dakota Trade Office, National Ag Transportation Advisory Board, the North Dakota Soybean Council, Cass County Crop Improvement Association, and the Board for Identity Ag Processing, another one of Bob's companies. On a personal level, he's been on, or is on, Local Job Development Authority, Dollars for Scholars Program, and the Castleton Ambulance Board. So with that, we welcome these three gentlemen here today. So these are very informal gatherings. In fact, the key to the success of these is that I talk very little and you guys talk a lot. The less I talk, the more information you get out of these events. So any questions that you've got, just raise your hands, grab a mic, ask these guys questions. These are an open discussion, they're not a presentation, so we'll start it out and I give each of these guys a couple minutes to give some opening remarks and then we'll get into our conversation. Bob, you want to start?
Sure. Well, let me start by saying that I speak quite often at different industry events. Kurt called me about this. My immediate reactions was, and actually Jim and I were talking about it. Sure, I can do that. And I thought, after I said that, I thought, what the hell am I going to talk about that's going to be helpful with this group? Because I would suspect that many of you have served on boards. I've had a laundry list of boards that I've served on. Some have been governmental, some have been industry, and of course we have some private company boards that I serve on and chair. Just a couple things briefly. Obviously the benefit that we've had with serving on a board is the networking, building relationships with people. But even more than that, the constructive participation from the talent on boards can be so valuable to an organization or to a company. Aside from that, I can't think of one board where you don't have a minority of the board members that basically carry the load. I've been on some national boards, 10% of us did all the work. And so that's some frustrations that we have, and part of that comes back to how a board meeting might be run by a chairman, or who those board members are. So I think there's some things that we might be able to share today, just to enlighten some of the experiences that we've had. Kurt, who would you like next?
Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, and as we discussed, I had the same response. What the hell am I going to contribute to this discussion? And then when I sent an email to Kurt about past and current board involvement, I said, I do have a lot of experience, don't I? I never really realized that, so that was kind of fun. Interestingly enough, I'm involved out where I have a lake home in Minnesota, and my wife and I built a place up there a few years ago to get away from things, decompress on the weekends, that kind of thing. Sure enough, within the first year, I got invited to serve on the board of the Lake Association, and now currently on the Lake Foundation. We have a fundraising foundation. And Kurt asked me about this, and I said, you want to talk about a challenging political board, you go to a lake association, it's very personal with people, you know, generational, and that was a challenging environment, especially for me at the time, being the youngest guy with about 20 years on that board. That was a good experience. But really my opening comment here is serving on a board for me is a privilege. I look at it as an honor when I get invited to serve on a board. I look at it as a great learning experience. I've told many stories of whether it's serving on a board or a particular project I've worked on where I say, boy, I felt like I just got an MBA in whatever I just did for the last 2 years serving on that board. So I feel like I've had about 6 advanced degrees now and all the different things I've been involved in boards. So looking forward to a good discussion here.
Well, thank you. It's good to see all of you today. I think probably what I'm interested in is some learning from all of you as well. Because I certainly don't have all of the answers. In fact, there are some days when I don't think I have any of the answers anymore. But I think a couple of things. I was relative to Jim's story about the Lake Owners Association. I'm a new member of a property owners association here in Fargo. We downsized, bought a townhome on the south side. I attended my first meeting a couple of nights ago, and the matter of board election or new board nominees came up. And no one raised their hand. There were no nominations. So I thought, well, maybe this board doesn't have to do all that much. And we never did get any nominations. So one, there was no process for succession in the board. So that's one thing I think we can talk about is important. No recruitment. The second thing is we then spent the next hour and a half discussing some fairly serious issues that were facing the board or facing the homeowners association. So in fact, a strong governance structure and organizing, a force of organization was really needed, and yet no one was stepping forward. So courageous boards is something I talk about as well. And that's crucial. So I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Eric. I guess one thing we kind of wanted to, got a pretty good mix here. A lot of you are first-time attendees here because I sat down last week and I started going through some of the nonprofits here in Fargo and invited a lot of you personally. So I just wanted to get a show of hands. How many people here today work for or run nonprofits? So a good chunk of the room. And the rest are private business owners, I assume, and so we're a pretty good mix. And that's part of the reason these guys are on the panel too. Jim is in private business, large real estate. Bob is in private business, but a 5th generation family owned, which is critical to have a board in a company of that structure. And Eric, of course, with the Ann Carlson Center being a nonprofit, so I think they bring a good wealth, good variety to this panel. So,
well, lots of credit to Bob, by the way, because probably the most difficult governance structure they have is with a family, right?
It can be challenging.
There's some very unique and special challenges that are important.
So the first segment we wanted to have, we're going to have probably 4 15-minute segments. There'll be open Q&A at the end, but there's Q&A throughout. So anytime you've got a question, if there's any questions right now, just feel free to raise your hands. The first thing we're going to talk about is definition of a board. Is it a board of directors? Is it a board of advisors? What's the difference? What should you have? So if anybody wants to jump on that right off the bat. Does anybody here have a board of advisors versus a board of directors? Rachel?
For one of my healthcare businesses.
Okay.
That's
Yep.
what we're developing right now.
Okay.
I think that's an important point. There are a lot of advisory boards people are asked to serve on. And let me give an example. When, let's see, Governor Hoeven first implemented the North Dakota Trade Office, our chairman of the advisory board was Lieutenant Governor Jack Darnapole at the time. So what we did is we put together a board of exporters, and I was asked to serve. And So we started meeting, and after about the second meeting, we were asked for some policy decisions. And we started making motions and voting, and all of a sudden we go, whoa, wait a minute here. This is not an advisory board. If we're making motions and setting policy and making decisions, we're a board of directors. So there's a clear difference there. Advisory boards are advising. They're helping the operations of a company or an organization, or providing input and providing suggestions. If you're making policy decisions or voting and making decisions on the operations of the company or the organization, you are a board of directors. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. I think there's obviously, I serve on an advisory board on the national level, a couple of them, and I did serve on the North Dakota North Dakota Trade Office Advisory Board. We are now a board of directors. So.
Yeah, it makes a difference, and it depends on the control structure of the organization. This is Mom, doesn't have to be. For the 100 Inc., for example, we've got an advisory board for that. It's a small group. Jim was on right at the beginning. I had no idea what I was doing at the beginning. Our board meetings were twiddling our thumbs, wondering what do we do. I've never run a nonprofit before. I've never structured board meetings. They've gotten a lot better since you left.
Since I left.
Since you left. Not because you left, but since you left. Yeah. So it is a learning experience, but it is a board of advisors, because the 100 Inc. is essentially, I get to make the final decision, and that's the case with a lot of privately owned companies. The president, the owner, the person at the top makes that final decision regardless of what that board might say. So it's advisors versus directors. And then,
yeah, this is a good definition between a formal director and an advisor, and I think it goes to the legal structure of your organization. If you're a privately held business, are you a publicly traded business? We don't have a lot of those in Fargo. Crop or industry organizations, and it really is driven by what Kurt started to talk about, the legal structure of the organization, bylaws, organizational agreements, incorporation documents. What do those documents require that organization to have? And usually those board requirements or seats are defined in the organizational docs somewhere. So there's a legal component of this, and usually a formal board of directors has more of a legal fiduciary responsibility to the organization. A governance agreement, a lot of that's built into these organizational docs we're talking about, and usually that's when a line is crossed into a need for officers and directors insurance as well. Like Bob said, when you're voting on important policy decisions that are having true effect at the company, the organization, there's always the likelihood or possibility of lawsuits or the legal ramifications. So you want to have that E&O insurance out there. The other side of that is more of an advisory board. I have served on a few advisory boards. The most interesting was probably for a private family-held business conglomerate that had a variety of businesses, and they wanted an informal, non-voting advisory board. And I said, well, that sounds interesting. And they said, we'll pay you. And I said, okay, I'll come to a meeting. So, we didn't vote on things. It was just an interesting, privately held business who wanted a group of 3 or 4 people. There was an attorney, a CPA, a real estate guy, and like an investment advisor. This was a high net worth, diversified company, and they just simply wanted 2 to 3 hour meetings quarterly or maybe twice a year to go over the whole operation. And we would simply give our opinion or advice. There's no voting, there's no fiduciary responsibilities. And they paid me $500 a meeting. I said, that's kind of cool. And we're still a networking.
What advisory board is this?
Yeah. The only one I've ever been on that paid me $500 a meeting. That was nice.
Well, actually, both Bob and Jim bring up a good point about compensation relative to boards. We may or may not want to get into discussion about it. I think all boards ought to be compensated, including nonprofit boards, above a certain level of sophistication and funding. Because of the requirements that we have now for board members in terms of reading the materials in advance. Bob mentioned earlier about 10% of the board doing the work. And I suspect on some boards, that's right. There's probably 10% of people who actually read the materials, understand what's being discussed and what decisions are going to be made. So I think there are a lot of requirements that we place on volunteers. I'm speaking probably more in the nonprofit sector. I assume that most investor-owned organizations do compensate boards. And there are some very large nonprofits who are actually considered to be commercial charities who do in fact compensate their board. So that's one thing to think about. Relative to board makeup and the advisor and so forth, I think Jim did a nice job of explaining in terms of organizational documents and so forth. From a practical, and that would dictate the purpose of the board and parameters of their particular latitude that they might have. But in terms of at least the organization I currently am CEO of, I look for both advising capacity as well as decision-making capacity in that board. So I like to have in fact we've even reduced it to a matrix where we have certain skill sets that we like to have on that board. And recently, of course, a lot of the headlines with malware and so forth, it's becoming increasingly important to have digital folks. The problem we run into is there aren't a lot of security experts. They're hard to find even on a paid basis, much less have someone who has that background to at least, maybe they can't tell you precisely what you ought to do, and most CEOs resist being told precisely what to do anyway, but they can at least point the direction. They can help you a little bit with it. And so I like to see a diversity in terms of backgrounds.
Yeah, and I think the instinct is always to recruit your peers or your friends to a board, but I think diversity is the key. Get some different people from different sectors and experiences out there.
Yeah, and you know, we've done that on one of our boards that we try to find, you know, it's always good to have someone that's got some strong finance background, challenge the company a little bit, challenge the CEO. That's all good, but there's also a lot of things with government programs now, people that might have a better connection to the political environment for government programs, because no matter if it's nonprofit or private, there's government programs out there that can be accessed by companies and organizations. The other thing that we've tried to do is let's diversify, let's get the millennials on board, let's get some difference in gender. I think it's important. A lot of boards that I've served on have been male dominant, and right or wrong, that's the way they have been. In my opinion, they should be there should be more gender diverse, and I think we need to involve the ladies in our society and in business more on our boards. So legal, finance, all of those things, I think strong people, strong in marketing, all good diverse talent, I think, that can bring positive things to a board of directors.
Is there an ideal size board? And what are the...
You know, my only experience with that, depending on either a private sector or a nonprofit, has been usually around 5 people.
Yeah.
You know, no one likes too big of a board. It's hard to get consensus, and I think it's easier to sit in the back and kind of hunker down and not get involved when you got 15 people on board.
Right.
5 people, you're usually all at the table staring at one another, and it's easier to get consensus in voting. But I think that varies a lot by what type of industry and what type of board we're talking about here.
Yeah, some of those are set by statute, some are set by law through government agencies or industry boards. For example, the United Soybean Board, there's representatives from every state, so you can about imagine, you know, we've got 50 or so members on that board. Ideally, I'm going to be probably a little bit higher than Jim, maybe 9 to 10 might be a good number. I like small size boards, but I think in general, when you look at the size of the company or the size of the organization, you might consider. My mother served on the Merit Care board, and she commented that, look, our board was too big. We had 30-some or 35, and it was too big.
I think 9 to 11 is what I like to shoot for if I have the opportunity to rule, you know, talk about the numbers if we're able to set that number.
Okay, that sort of leads us into the next segment. We want to talk about the responsibilities of the board. You talk about who you're gonna get on your board, financial expert, maybe a tech expert, industry experts, and then we're gonna talk about the responsibilities and the role of the board members. Anybody wanna hit that?
Well, I'll start by just talking a little bit about risk management. It's really kind of a challenge sometimes when a board has to try and balance the difference between taking an inappropriate risk that might lead to a misfortune of the company or the organization versus avoiding risks that, to the extent that you might miss things that are significant, an opportunity. And so balancing those things as a board, I mean, you certainly have to act honestly, avoid conflicts of interest, act in good faith, due diligence, respect confidentiality. But that risk management really becomes right back to liability things, that the D&O insurance that we talked about. Those are some key responsibilities. And you know, I've always been an advocate that if you're going to serve on a board, do it with passion, do it with conviction, that you want to really take an interest in what you're serving, and do your homework and be prepared for board meetings.
Yeah, I think as a general comment, I think we can all agree on is that what is the ultimate role of a director? It is generally policy driven, not at an operational or execution level. So when you talk about what is the role of a director, it's typically not running day-to-day operations. You're having quarterly, semi-annually, annual meetings, and you're going over policies, procedures sometimes, risk management, overseeing financials, that type of thing. But I think it's always interesting, though, there are times in unforeseen or even unfortunate circumstances where a board sometimes has to take over the company and start running things. If there is a CEO that leaves unexpectedly or has to be terminated, things like that. So even though I think generally speaking a board of directors is a policy oversight type of thing, there also has to be some capability and willingness to step up when times get tough or circumstances present themselves. I can speak from firsthand experience. I had to do that one time, involved with a young company that I was on the board as an investor in the company, and I was the bad guy that had to come in, fire the CEO, take over the company, do my best to try to salvage the company unsuccessfully, and ultimately shut it down. Investors lost money, the company no longer exists. That is not a fun thing to do. Very controversial, but as a director, sometimes you have to step up and do the tough job and do the right thing, and in that case, take over a company and shut it down.
I think one of the, I try to communicate mostly through stories. I once served on a board as a representative of my employer. We had invested, we were an early investor in a productivity software company. And so as I was on the board, was I representing the interests of my employer in terms of the management of that company or policies for that company, or was I there to help direct and guide the growth of the company? And sometimes that may seem simple. Oh no, you're there because your company invested. But sometimes the purpose of the organization might be served better by one direction, and preservation of capital, if that's what your employer is looking for, becomes a different issue. And back to Bob's point about the conservative nature. So I think it does, my point is you need to think through what is it that you represent on the board. And in fact, the board, as you recruit people, you need to talk to them about what it is that they represent. I've been on one of the 50 state boards you were talking about, the 50 representatives. I was a CEO or executive director of an organization that once had 64 board members, because we were dictated by funders to have somebody that represented this group, somebody that represented this group, and so forth. Well, it was an impossible group to run. What we eventually did, we developed a 11-member executive committee, and the executive committee made all the decisions. But I don't know if that was right as I look back on it. Was that the right thing to do? Were we representing interests? But that was very difficult in terms of trying to reach consensus if everyone represented only their specific desk. So I think it's something to think about. One is your own board, or you as a member of the board, as well as developing boards for the future.
One point, board of directors are expected to do the strategic planning, review your mission statement, set a vision for the company, review your bylaws. Bylaws are always set at the beginning of the company. You may be coming on a board 4 or 5 years later. I've always maintained that bylaws should be reviewed at least every other year. Because the way things change in our society and the way things are evolving through IT and all the different things, I think bylaws need to be reviewed at least semi-annually.
You know, I had two quick things I was going to say that prompted another thought in my head here. I also like to tell stories and examples. One of the boards I'm involved in now, where the director had suggested retaining an outside strategic planning consultant to do strategic planning. And the cost was such that I was not comfortable of that dollar amount as a member of that board, and led the board to not approve that. Well, then the staff of this organization looks at us directors and says, well, put your money where your mouth is. Now we're going to do it in-house. And I said, fine, let's do it. And then we've been in 6 months of meetings doing strategic planning as a member of the board. So I can't, but hey, we saved a significant amount of money, and again, it was part of the comment of, if you're going to be on that board, be willing to step up and be involved and put some time in. I was going to back up a little bit, if I may, Kurt, and just talk back to our first segment when we were talking about kind of who and what type of skill set should be on the board of directors. And I was going to talk a little bit more towards the private sector entrepreneurs in the room, assuming we have some entrepreneurs. And my experience running a lot in venture capital and angel capital types of circles, whenever you're an entrepreneur or an early stage company or even an advanced company, you're out seeking outside investment capital. A lot of times you gotta go raise $1 million to grow your company, or 10 million. Usually that's a trigger that if some investor is gonna give you $1 million, that investor is gonna say, I need a seat on your board, because I wanna protect my investment or that group of investors. And that kind of tied into that story I said, an emerging entrepreneurial company that I got on the board of and didn't go so well. But as an entrepreneur, usually that's a point where it triggers having to give up some control. And you're not only giving up some percentage of ownership of your company when you start raising outside capital, but you usually give up some amount of oversight on your board by having to have at least one, if not more, investors. And that presents a whole other set of challenges, because sometimes those greedy capitalist investors simply want to triple their money in 18 months and get out of here, and sometimes that's a challenging relationship to have from the entrepreneurs. But that's simply the way it is. As soon as you cross that line to accepting outside investment capital, usually that's a trigger to have to diversify that board.
And nonprofits aren't immune from that either, because we have people that invest capital. It's called donors. And sometimes gifts can be given in a way that also you have to think about, is that the kind of control and involvement and engagement? How do you do that?
Any different legal liabilities involved in with investors on the board, or? I read somewhere, whether it was accurate or not, but I don't think in the history of the United States a board member has ever been successfully sued for liability of what went on in the company.
Yeah, you mentioned that a while back. I found that interesting.
Yeah.
Because I've always been a paranoid guy who's wanted that insurance if I'm going to serve on a private board or even a nonprofit board. So that made me feel a little more at ease in my willingness to serve. But.
And that may be inaccurate. I just throw things out.
Oh, so you made this up?
I just hear things and I just spew them out.
I've got one question. This is probably from the nonprofit side of things, but you all probably have some experience on boards as well. One of the struggles has always been when you're filling a board of a nonprofit is, A, you're looking for people with specific skill sets. So it could be an attorney, it could be a CPA, it could be an IT person. At the same time, you're looking for people who are going to be able to fundraise for you, either donate personally or open the doors for friends. Then on the other hand, there are funders sometimes who have requirements that you have the individuals who you're providing services to be represented on the board, and oftentimes in a nonprofit, you're working with individuals who really do not have any means to support the nonprofit in any way. I'm just curious from your experiences or any thoughts and opinions you have on how do you work with those kinds of situations or suggestions on how to fill a board? What has your experience been?
Well, I think, yeah, great question.
No idea.
Yeah, look to your bylaws and then see. But I think I think it is personally my perspective on mandating certain individuals or groups of individuals on a board is dysfunctional. It doesn't work well, but you're stuck with that requirement. I know in some work we're both familiar with a couple of organizations in town that would have that. So I think again maybe board recruitment is an issue. Can you find someone who represents a group that has some of the requisite experience and they have a broader experience? Because you can't get around the legal requirements to do that. So another way that I have worked in some organizations is a very aggressive and focused board education process. Both the orientation coming into the board, so the selection process, then the orientation, and then continuing education. Most of the I think the boards that I feel like have been successful are ones that spend most of their time with education about some emerging issue or some issue that the organization is dealing with. And second, most of their agenda deals with what Jim was talking about, is strategic planning. And we don't talk, we have dashboards and other ways that people can look at information and then ask about those areas that might seem troubling to them, but we don't spend most of the meeting going through a long list of information that management has. Because management can engage a board for hours with just information that we have. And it's kind of interesting, and it has some stuff, and you can make it powerful. But what the board really needs to deal with is the strategy. So I don't know if that helps, but you work with the situation you have, and then through maybe education, orientation, and recruitment. And one of the things we might be able to develop in this area is board recruitment process. We now through, I don't suppose we're supposed to point out members of the audience, but there's an organization that's represented here today that has taken this region light years ahead of where we were in terms of executive recruitment. Maybe we need to think about the same for boards, whether they're volunteer boards or others.
My only thought on that, Greg, is I think it comes back to a diversity of the board. I'm not quite sure how to recruit that diversity, but some of my observations are in the nonprofit world. It's good to have a mix on that board of who the actual kind of the targeted audience is of whatever service the nonprofit is providing, and then balancing that with the so-called fat cats who are good at raising money. Whomever, the Steve Shield from Shields kind of person, Dick Solberg from State Bank. The guys who are good at raising money. So I think it comes back to diversity on that board and having a good mix. And I would say whenever someone approaches me about donating money to an event or a cause or a nonprofit event, I will often respond more affirmatively when I know that person who's on the Arts Council or on TNT Fitness Center. If I know that person's on that board, I'm more inclined to donate the $100 or buy a table at the event or whatever. And if I don't know this person, I don't know that individual. So a lot of that comes down to relationship. I think that's an important part of the fundraising part of it.
I think it's a really good point. That's a good point. I don't really have much to add, but a good question.
I'd like to hear some discussion from you three about this recruitment of board members. I serve as the director of a nonprofit, And recruiting of board members and the role of the board or a nominating committee and the role that the director should take in that kind of recruitment. To find that right balance of board members that aren't just my friends.
Well, you know, you first started by saying, you know, put together a nominating committee. So get a diverse nominating committee that's maybe got some networking, knows people in the community. I don't know if there's anything magical about it. I think you just have to just do some soul searching and thinking about, you know, who might be show some interest in this organization, be willing to commit the time, socially active, those types of things. Those are the types of people with some diverse talent, the people that we typically look for when we're trying to fill a board. But let's remember that, and we're going to get into this in another segment here, but a lot of people are somewhat reserved when they get on a board and really a little bit less likely to speak up. And that comes back to the role of the chairman. I've chaired a number of boards, and it's really the chairman's responsibility to make sure that people do express their opinion. Chuck, what do you think? You know, it's those types of things that really comes back to the chair. And sometimes a chairman can be actively, you know, asking the directors for input. So I'm kind of losing my train of thought here, but good question. I think you just have to think outside the box a little bit. You know, how do we best locate these people?
A couple of organizations I've been involved with, we actually used a formal process for a board, and we did. It's a bit laborious, I think, as I think about, well, how am I going to describe this? But it does give us balance. And what we do is, any board member or executive management member can identify an individual they think might fit the criteria that we've set up for board. We have written criteria, and then we have the matrix that I mentioned earlier about skill sets. Then the board chair and the CEO together conduct an interview with the individual. Then we ask them to complete, in both cases, the questions were a little bit different, but ask them to complete just a 2-page, a short kind of series of some open-ended questions about why they would want to serve, what has been there, and then a little bio in terms of their experience. Then that material plus the notes from the combined interview are presented to a nominating committee, and then the nominating committee makes a decision. So it's a few steps. It's maybe not where you want it, but it does provide focus, and it does give you a bit of a vetting, screening process. And that's what we've used in a couple of instances, and it seems to work pretty well.
So I have a couple questions based on some things that you've been saying. You're really saying that somewhere between 5 and 11 is sort of a sweet spot for boards, which I agree with you. But if you have a nominating committee on a 5-member board, that's pretty much your board. So, I mean, I think all executives hope that there's a finance committee and a nominating committee and a development committee, but 5 to 11 volunteers, you're asking a ton of them above and beyond just coming and doing governance and doing fiduciary and all those pieces. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. And my second question is not meant to put you on the spot, but I'm going to absolutely put you on the spot. So the two
Put Jim on the spot.
yeah, not you, sir, because you do the right I do, yes. The two of you run huge businesses, your names are well known, you're big deals in this community. A little organization like the Arts Partnership needs big deal board members, but can't get to big deal board members. So I'm wondering from your perspective, how can smaller nonprofits that don't have the kind of boards that make sense for you to necessarily join, how can we get to maybe 2nd and 3rd tier executives in businesses that are a little bit out of what you would necessarily expect an arts nonprofit to attract?
Ask.
Yeah.
Simply ask.
I'm asking.
Okay, so, but that's really, I mean, ask people. If you see someone out there, don't be afraid to ask them. I mean, it's a simple black and white question. They're gonna maybe want to know a little bit about their responsibilities. How many times are we meeting a year? Those types of things. Ask.
Yeah, I think I don't mind being asked, not every day, but approached. I get approached regularly, weekly, by people saying, Jim, you have an idea for this, or I'm looking to hire this, I need a CPA in my office, or this nonprofit I have needs board members, you have any ideas for me? And as Crystal knows, most often I say, no, my slate's full, I'm busy, serve on a lot of boards. But I had one example where a good friend of mine called and said, Jim, we want someone with commercial real estate experience, preferably a woman, because we're all men on this board. We're trying to. I said, yeah, I got one of my people, one of my second-tier people, and I'll give that person a pep talk. And I have a female commercial real estate, 25 years experience on that board now. So the question was asked, I had an idea, took a minute of my time, and we got that person placed, and that board got a seat filled. So yeah, ask the question. I mean, I don't mind getting asked, and again, I think a lot of us are busy and have our slates full, but I will always return phone calls and do what I can. Again, if anyone ever texts or emails or calls me, you know, I respond quite quickly usually, no matter how busy I am.
You know, the other thing about that is if you were to ask me and I said, you know, I'm really sorry, but I don't know if I have time, you might ask, do you have any suggestions? Okay?
Do the follow-up question.
Yeah, follow up with that. I've never been afraid to, you know, my wife accuses me of not saying no enough to things people ask me to do, but gee, if I feel I can't, I might have a good suggestion. Or is there someone in your company that might be interested in doing it? So ask.
I was going to say, kind of a guerrilla tactic of this is find out what the succession plan is for Jim Buus, and ask that person. The same thing with Bob Sinner.
Right.
Is ask that individual, because there's a tremendous amount of talent in organizations. That's why the organization succeeds. It's why Ann Carlson succeeds. It's why Goldmark and led the operations that Bob manages and runs. There's a lot of talent there, and those are the folks that are going to be in the positions at some point in time. But they're also very talented, and they run the day to day. So I think that's a place to look as well. And they're very enthusiastic. They have TNT as an example. We do some collaborations with TNT. We share some space and some other things in some of our Fargo programming. There's a whole set of individuals there that are involved with that group that that we have some interest in, because they're enthusiastic. They have kids in the program and so forth, and long term that's going to put you in good stead. So look for the second people. Look for the chief operating officers and
Another comment I was going to say on that point is the TNT Fitness Center is a good example, and then is try to find some commonality, whether it's kids or youth hockey or whatever. We talked to the analogy of the Lake Association, some kind of commonality that will help draw that person and or the second ring person. And the second thing I was going to say on this as well, maybe a sales pitch in a sense, something that I say, again, as a greedy capitalist business owner, I like to get my brand name, Goldmark Commercial Real Estate. I like to get it out around town, and if I can get someone on that board or that board or that board, and I always tell my people, wear your name tag, because I want my brand name of all the other people sitting on that table to see that name, and therefore network and maybe get a real estate lead out of it down the road, in addition to serving proudly on a board. So maybe that's a pitch. Maybe you say, would you like to get one of your people on my board to expose your brand name to a really powerful group of people? That type of thing.
And David, that's actually one of the things that I want to talk to you about. 10 days or 2 weeks ago, part of my intention with the 100 Inc., we started adding a few associate members who were nonprofits in the area. And the whole purpose of that was, one, to introduce the 100 plus CEOs and business owners that are in the 100 to the area nonprofits, and vice versa, introduce the nonprofits to some of the business owners. And that's part of the collaboration that we're working on. So
Great.
that's why there's several nonprofits here today.
Can I just make the point that nonprofit leaders are business owners?
Right, yeah, that's a good point, yeah. Thank you.
I can add, because I'm affiliated with the Plains Art Museum, which you're familiar with, and also a TNT Kids Place. And the reason I'm on the board of the museum, a little bit selfishly, is because I wanted to meet people in the community, and I also wanted to support the artists. But the reason I'm on there is because my predecessor was on the board, it was Ron Robinson, and he had to step off, and so then he recruited me to take his place. So it was just going back to asking for that second tier, and then like with TNT, the reason I'm on is because I proposed on some financing, I didn't get it, Bremer did, yay for Bremer. But then they came back to me and said, you know, we really liked your proposal, we liked what you did. Again, selfishly, I want to meet people on that board. Will you join our board? And I'm like, of course I will. So it's just, like they said, just ask and ask for that second tier.
Just a comment on that. I think the ask is hard though, and so I'm on the board of Bonanzaville.
Okay.
So I appreciate your comment, Dana. I think this is an important section of the talk because I think for nonprofits, this is the biggest challenge. I think is recruiting board members, and I think we think that the pool of potential board members is the whole community, but I think realistically what happens is it's the people that love the organization. That's your pool. So it's people who are into the arts, like you, or it's people who are into Bonanzaville or the things that Bonanzaville does, and that's the pool. And so how do we move outside that? And I don't think it's an easy answer, but that to me is the biggest challenge for nonprofits is that people on the board love the organization, right? I mean, they think the world of Bonanzaville. That's who I'm on the board of Bonanzaville. They love it, but they don't always make the best board members because they don't fit the profile or the requirements that we may want of them, and we can't find them in our membership. And so going outside is very difficult. And so I don't have a question, but I just think more focus on how do we move outside our pool, our normal pool of where our board comes from. That's really
a really good point.
Great.
I've got a question probably for you, Bob. Other people weigh in, but when you spoke about a 5-generation family, and I run into this working with families who set up foundations. You know, the first, maybe even the second generation, there aren't too many issues about who's going to serve on the board. But you start getting down to third, fourth, fifth. You know, how do you determine as you get this large extended family and you just have a small board? What kind of strategy have you used with your own family in determining who sits on the board of your company?
Well, how much time do we have? We have about 4 family companies. The farming company and the SB&B Foods, the marketing, the international business part of our business is 7 of us. Okay, there's 3 of my generation, and then my 3 boys and my partner's son. So there's 7 of us, 4 of the 5th generation. That's our board, okay? And we talk about succession. Some of that is difficult, and we have to, even though this is a family business, we have to put family emotions aside and run it as a business. Sounds easier than it is, but you need to do it. And you have to talk about the tough, difficult things. And so we're going through that process now. I'm not going to be there forever. I expect to be there probably five years or more yet, but we're beginning the process of, okay, Bob, when you step back, you know, how are we going to transition your marketing expertise into the, you know, how are we going to handle that? And so, then we have our farm is owned by the family. 30 grandchildren, 30 children my age, my generation, and my parents, and my dad's brothers, kids, and so a big group. And the way we've done that is that each family has representatives on that land board that sets the cash rent every year and sets the policies for how to handling, how to maintain the property. And those board members then are elected by their families, their specific families. And so it's a good process, it works well. And we don't always agree, but the success of any partnership in any company is the ability to agree to disagree. And we've made it work. A good question.
I have a question, more of a comment than a question. You talked about the nominating committee being a very important part to a board. And I can add a little to this. I've been on 4 different boards. 3 of them run very well, and 1 is run very poorly. And Jim, I have the same experience of being on a lake board. And the experience was the only way you got off of your position was to find your replacement. So guess what? That board didn't run very well because most people wanted to get out and just find that person to fill their spot instead of finding the right person to do it. So that part about finding people for your board will make that board run so much better if you get the right people on that.
Yeah, and I think Eric brought up a really good point. You know, maybe all the board members are challenged with bringing 2 or 3 names forward that they think would be good representatives. You know, maybe you'll have some overlap, but at the same point, I think it gets everybody a little bit more involved, especially on the smaller boards that you haven't got the 9 to 10, you've got the 5 to 6. And it puts an awful lot of responsibility if you have a nominating committee of 1 or 2. So that might be a better approach.
Well, I also might mention that thank you. We actually don't have a nominating committee. We have a governance committee. We call it, we use Carver Policy Governance in Ann Carlson. But so the governance committee acts as the nominating committee, so we kind of double up. We also put our finance committee together with our human resource committee. We call it the human and financial capital, because there's human capital, right? So that helps a little bit with the numbers. But I thought maybe with the Arts Coalition that you came right from our recent board meeting, where it was discussed with 11 board members. Eric, how are we going to staff all these, or how do we work with all the committees? But anyway, we have a governance committee that's also responsible for managing the affairs of the board, because I think that the CEO's job is to manage the enterprise, and the chair of the board manages the board. So I don't sign off on travel vouchers for board members, so we don't create issues about, well, you know, it's really 150 miles to this place, not 250. But you know, I've never run into that with Ann Carlson, but I've run into it with other organizations where CEO is required to sign off on board member travel, and there weren't real good results from that. But so the governance committee actually governs the affairs of the board, and that's helpful too.
Eric, does that happen with input from you? Do you have input into that committee?
Oh, the governance?
Yes.
Yeah, I serve as ex officio, non-voting on all of the committees, but they can always call for executive session, and nobody takes it personally if they want to talk outside of the earshot of the CEO. But I think sometimes if boards feel like they have to talk outside of the earshot of the CEO, I think maybe either you don't have the right board, you don't have the right CEO. I mean, the board doesn't have the right CEO, because you need to be a pretty integral part of that. But yeah, I participate in those.
Probably this is for you, Bob. I work with a lot of family business, and of course, you know, family is always fun. Yep. It's the fun and the dysfunctional part. But the idea of, maybe you've got some ideas, but how has the board, or maybe some of the things that you did early on that helped your family really function? Because I come from a family, 3 brothers. There's all 3 of us had very, very, very different visions as to where that business would go, so we're not together from that standpoint. But, and I've also got some other dysfunctions going on too in a lot of my clients. So how does a board, in your experience, help maybe at least mitigate or address some of that?
Well, one of the things that we have in our partner operation, so there's 7 of us, we have a partnership agreement. And just like all bylaws of any company, any organization, we review it. We review it every couple of years because we need to possibly make changes. But a partnership agreement deals with everything: death, divorce, succession, buyouts, all of that. And they take time. They take time to put them together, but end of the day, that's your rule, and everybody follows it. Most of the time in family businesses, when you have partners, family members that break up, it's mostly because of people wanting to take more time off than someone else. Now, let's be honest here. Everybody has different personal needs, and we understand that. And I have partners that will tell me that I probably work the hardest of all of the group. I'm fine with that. And I have some partners that take way more time off than I do. I'm okay with it as long as they don't abuse it, and if it's family need. So it very seldom becomes an issue. The other thing that's unique about our company is that, you know, for the business community, I'm the president. But internally, we don't run our board meetings as a president-run organization. I can tell you, in 40 plus years of being at our company, we have never once taken a vote. Everything is done by consensus. We don't always agree, but we agree to disagree, and we go by consensus and move on. Right or wrong, that's the way we made it work.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Got one situation right now with a couple of brothers, but have you, in any of your partnership agreements, you know, you've got the divorce, you've got all the other things that come up, a performance clause? If they are not able or they're not performing
Yes.
to a certain level?
Performance in terms of disability, things like that, yes. But performance to a certain level, no, because, you know, who's to judge? That becomes a little bit, and that's what I addressed, that's kind of what happens with companies or family businesses. Some will say, you know, look, I'm doing all the work, you're off running to a concert someplace, those types of things, and that becomes difficult, no question.
So that may be a good segue into any experience you've had with removing board members. So as hard as it is to recruit them, I think sometimes organizations need to make room to get the right people on, and they have somebody who is just not functioning well. So can you comment on any experience you've had with that?
You know, as far as experience, I mentioned one private company I was involved in where it was kind of where I thought Harlan was going with the performance metric there, where we had a director who simply wouldn't attend meetings, wouldn't call in on conference calls, and they simply said, "Dude, are you interested?" And I said, "No, not really." And he said, "Fine, just politely glide away and get someone in." So I mean, that was a pretty straightforward answer there. So, and I think that kind of goes into what I think is our next segment, that is effective meeting management and board meetings themselves, participation and things like that. So I don't have any experience with legal or partnership agreement structures that had any kind of metric or standard for participation. As Bob said, who's to judge? I'm not saying that's not a bad deal. Sometimes that's good. You have to attend a certain number of board meetings or serve on at least one subcommittee or be responsible to raise X amount of money or chair one event. I think that's okay. I just don't have a lot of experience with that.
And John, I don't know that I've ever had a situation that I can think of. My memory is sometimes short, but that where we've had to remove or had a board member removed. You know, I've been on national boards where the Secretary of Agriculture makes the appointees. Most of your boards and board members have term limits. And so the term limit runs out, and does he get reelected, right? Or she? Gotta be careful here, but so I really haven't had that experience. Yeah, we've certainly had our experiences with how would you say it, not very active board members, or maybe working against the company, or not being proactive. We've had those experiences. But to actually physically remove someone, not had that experience.
So our bylaws do allow sort of the only performance standard is really attendance. And so you both mentioned that if you miss a certain number of board meetings, you're not engaged, you should go. But I think with small boards, if you have somebody who's not involved at all, and you only have 5 seats at the table, you wish they would miss some meetings, right? I mean, you really need to make room for somebody who's going to be more engaged, and I think that's sort of a challenge.
Yeah, and if they miss 2 or 3 meetings, maybe it's the chairman's responsibility to say, are you still interested? Are you really committed to this? Would you rather leave and we replace you? Maybe he's waiting for that, or she.
It's been my experience that the chair handles those issues, so I've never seen a point where we had to actually take official action to do that. But certainly there have been discussions and some consensus developed, and the chair generally has, I think maybe one case I might have been involved in it years ago, but some way that it has to be done. But maybe there ought to be some other performance metrics. I'm not sure exactly how to set them outside of attendance that's clear and not subjective, but like reading materials and so forth. Although you can use some board portals now that you can check to see who checked in and spend some time on the portal. I learned that from a hospital board that I currently serve on. We said, hey, we don't want this stuff paper anymore. We want it digital. Put it all on the portal. And the CEO said, well, yeah, but I could check to see if you actually check in.
That could be helpful.
Yeah, go ahead.
You led right in kind of where I was going when you talked about the portal and seeing who's actually. Have you used GoTo or Skype? Are you seeing a trend using that when you're talking about attendance? Sometimes somebody's got you're having a meeting in Minneapolis, but you've got to be in Dickinson and you can't make it there in 6 hours.
We're certainly doing more of that, and with video conferencing, we don't have a lot of video conferencing locations in Fargo, but there are some. There's one at the university. But yeah, we have a company over in western Wisconsin, and sometimes we'll do a conference call, a board meeting, or do it by GoToMeeting. Some will participate by Skype, absolutely. And when times happen like that, people are busy. The other thing that back to your question, John, there was a law that was introduced. Well, it's not a law. It was a bill that was introduced at the last legislative session. And it was quite surprising, but the law, or the bill, was to allow the Commissioner of Agriculture to physically remove a board member from any of the commodity groups if he so felt it was necessary. It was bad legislation. I didn't like it, and it was defeated badly because it can become political, and I really don't know where that all came from, but it quickly went away.
Yeah, that sort of naturally led us into running effective meetings, and we wanted to hit on just some bullet points. Key things that you do or use, tools, agenda, how to run a good effective meeting. How long should they be? How often should they be? And once you're there, to get the most out of it.
Well, there's lots to say about this one. Eric mentioned how sometimes the CEO can ramble and kind of lose focus. The buck stops with the chairman, and really, you've got an agenda. I would be careful about putting your important agenda items at the end of your agenda. Keep it up front, get your finances dealt with immediately when you've got your people fresh and at your board meetings. Stick to your agenda. Sometimes, you can get off on a tangent talking about different issues. That's the chairman's responsibility to bring you back, reel you back in and stay focused. The other thing that's very important as the chairman is to make sure people are heard. I've chaired enough meetings to know that there are people that everybody that's at the table has an opinion. Trust me, they do. And they may not be so outcoming or outgoing with expressing that opinion. The chairman needs to make sure they're asked. So those are just a few points.
You know, earlier in the session, Eric mentioned, he used the word courageous in the context of board meetings, and I jotted that down. I think that's, again, hopefully we can recruit and engage board members that are truly there and engaged in the meeting and are willing to be courageous when necessary and ask good questions and be involved. I think we've all been at meetings or board meetings where there is that individual that sits quietly at the end of the table and never raises any points, and you kind of wonder, why is that dud on our board? So to that note, we talked briefly about during meetings, and one of the things I've used in some of the meetings I've chaired over the years is calling on people, calling on the directors around the table. Instead of just a chairperson leading the meeting or you have a guest speaker, a lot of times if there's 10 agenda items, I will pick out a few of those, and a day or two ahead of time we'll talk to a particular member of the board and say, can you be the person that introduces this subject matter or that report or whatever piece of information it is. So if I'm chairing the meeting and they're going through our well laid out structured agenda, I can say, now Bob's going to talk to us about the quarterly financials, or Eric's going to talk about this initiative we're working on over here. So me as a chairperson can sit back, and you're calling on people, spreading the discussion around, trying to encourage people to stay involved in the meeting so they don't just get bored listening to one person at the head of the table. That's worked well for me in meetings.
I think, again, facilitation skills. I think the one of the trainings that I guess we've done 3 or 4 different times with board chairs is attend something on facilitation, how to facilitate a meeting and keep a meeting moving. And that helps along with an agenda, putting times on the agenda, how long you anticipate. Doesn't mean that you have to stick with that, because you could create issues that way, but well-organized agenda, kind of thought through. Last 2 or 3 boards I've worked with or served on, a lot of material in advance and summarized material. I get a charge out of, I hope there are no public accounting firms present today, otherwise we'll have a conversation afterwards, but how many meetings have you attended of a group that you belong to, whether it's homeowners, lake owner, country club, whatever, and they're displaying, the auditor's displaying the financial statements of the organization in a little screen, right, long ways away from where you are. Particularly in a meeting where they've served alcohol to get you there. There's no purpose to it. It doesn't work. Where I've seen some public accounting firms do the audit and they show you some graphs, so forth, that you understand, you know. And so I think how you prepare the information in advance, and how, if you have a committee structure, use it. Not all groups should have a committee structure. If a board of 5, maybe you don't need a committee structure. Or you use the advisory nature. There are some groups I've worked with where we have non-board members on committees. One, it's a recruitment. It's a way to vet and see how people are and so forth. So that's but that agenda, and then being able to facilitate a meeting. And then also putting a muzzle on the CEO from time to time, because some of us tell stories and we get a little involved.
Yeah, and I come back to what Eric said about financials. It can be very, very tedious and very lengthy. And we did the same thing in the North Dakota Trade Office. We have an auditor that presents financials at our quarterly meetings, and we're going, wait, whoa. This is way too deep for most of the guys. So 2 of us went in, sat down with the CEO, or our executive director, and our accountant guy, and said, this is the way we're going to present these financials. 1 pager, this is what you need to see. Yeah, if you want to dig into the weeds and ask more questions, you can, but this gives you a snapshot of where you're at financially. That's the way those financials need to be presented at a board meeting. The other thing that's important for board meetings is to make sure that good minutes are taken, particularly on controversial issues. So when you come back to that meeting 3 months later, you can review those minutes and you've got some key points in those minutes that were addressed on that particular issue. So another important item.
You know, kind of the summary of this is I think, kind of logical, and that is having a chairperson running that meeting that is well organized with a good strict agenda and can keep the discussion going and moving. And then I have a personal goal that no meeting should last more than an hour. And I realize that's not an exclusive rule, but that's a rule of mine, because I think we talked about never putting the important things towards the end of the agenda in a 3-hour meeting because half your people have left because they have commitments or kids to pick up or whatever. Keep that agenda reasonable. I'm not saying too short, but reasonable. It doesn't need to be 3 pages of material in 4 hours. Keep it short, keep the attention of the group going, and have a really good chairperson facilitating the discussion. I mean, pretty logical to me when you think about it, but yet I'm surprised at how many bad meetings I've had.
I'm a huge advocate of the one-page business plan. I think those are nice when they come to any meeting. Somebody that's put that together, a little paragraph about marketing, about target, about boom, 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 just right down the list. And if whoever is doing those can be preparing that one-page business plan on a quarterly basis, instead of even sending that out to the board prior to the meeting, it gets a lot of those questions out of the way. What else? You mentioned an hour meetings. That mean you want to wrap up here? Or is that...
Yeah, as soon as I said that, I've been here since 11, 2 hours and 15 minutes, but I'm not fidgeting too much here.
Picked up on that pretty well.
I don't pick up on the fact that nonprofits are also businesses, which is the worst thing for me to say because I own a nonprofit as a small business owner. Questions?
I have one question. In regards to the agenda and keeping it to an hour or ensuring that it's a tight meeting, do you favor, if a topic goes longer, do you favor the trying to squeeze in all of the agenda in that meeting, or bumping items that are not, that don't get an appropriate amount of time to the next meeting, or calling an intermediate meeting?
I think it's a judgment call. Quite frankly, if Jim needs to have an hour meeting, I'm not going to ask him to serve on the board of directors. Most of our board meetings are going to go 3 hours. It's just the way it is. There's enough material on organizations that I'm serving on that we have to have that much time. Sometimes we'll do it over lunch, sometimes we won't. But to your point, if you don't get to some items and you've got a deadline, if it's 12 noon, those items need to be prioritized, and those that don't get addressed get pushed to the next meeting.
That's one of the tools we'll talk about next month regarding traction. That's one of the key tools in traction is level 10 meetings, they call them. What's the 3 IDS? Identify, discuss, solve?
Identify, and it's always priority first.
Yep.
You only
Pushing
get
things.
through- You only get through the most important thing that's on the list, you did your work. The rest will wait.
Yeah, and I think too, if you have a very quick discussion with the board about it, if it's okay to defer. Because if you develop a consensus around that, then people feel better about that. One of the things, just a small trick that used for a long time, and that is for motions, when management is presenting something or a committee is presenting something, write the motion out in advance that you want. One, you make sure you get all the pieces of the motion. How many times early in my career I went back and said, oh yeah, I forgot that I had to ask for authorization to do this. They approved the project, but I didn't get authorization to sign the deed or whatever. So we're gonna, because how many board meetings you sat in, well, somebody tries to compose the motion, and then you ask the secretary, what did you get? And then the person who diligently tries to record the ramblings doesn't quite have it right. So then you, oh yeah, well we ought to put this up on the screen. Then we can all add it, right? And you get, so it takes a lot of time. That's my point. And you can write that out in advance. You can still change it, but you have something.
The final point on this topic, I think, is to try and use correct parliamentarian rules for your meetings. When you get a motion, you get a second before further discussions. You know, follow the rules because you become a little bit more structured that way. And in your case, you have a small board.
It's okay. Still do it by the rules.
No. It made me think about one of the boards I served on where in our bylaws allowed us to do electronic voting or email voting. So sometimes if we didn't have time in a regular meeting and we were up against a deadline of some kind, had to make a decision, the chair or executive could call an online vote, or we talked about doing meetings by a conference call, go to meeting, or calling a vote by email, and the bylaws allow for that type of thing. It's a way to sometimes fill those gaps.
Additional questions?
I'm part of a very small organization, and we're trying to figure out how to actually structure. So my first question is, with serving on boards outside of your company, does that help you develop your own company? Does that help you learn? Is that a worthwhile pursuit to go find other boards to serve on and use what you're seeing to help structure your own company? Is that does that make sense? Is that a good use of your time?
I think in my introductory comments I had kind of answered that, Chris, when I said yes, and I consider it a privilege to serve on different and diverse boards because I love getting exposed to different educational things, different businesses, different nonprofits, and how the people do things differently. I try to learn from that, and yes, absolutely, take that back to my business and personal life and try to apply some of that.
And then the follow-up question to that is, how do you find those boards? How do you get into that stuff?
Well, there seems to be a lot of people in the room that are interested in it.
We need to create a portal.
We need a portal. Those interested in serving on boards and those needing a poll of some kind going on.
The Dakota Medical Foundation might be one. It's okay to mention.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Dakota Medical Foundation is a place to start. They have obviously broad for conflict of interest purposes or disclosure purposes. I proudly serve on the Dakota Medical Foundation board. In fact, the board chair is here as well. But that's a place to start too. And in fact, we have had conversations at the board level. How do we how do we activate the volunteer group that's present in any community, but somehow we don't attract or we don't empower or engage them, and the same thing with board members as well. So I'd like the CEO to hear from you, and we can discuss it again at the board, because I think somebody has to facilitate some of that. 100 Inc. We joined 100 Inc. because one, we thought there were ideas here, and we thought there was innovation here, and so it's important for us to be a part of that network. I think there's a part of that is the network of either volunteers and or board members. So I think if someone doesn't sponsor it, maybe 100 Inc. could, or we need to find a place for that, because it is hard to kind of sort through all the opportunities, but there are a lot of them.
This is why I started reaching out to you guys to see what we can bring to the table and make happen. Any questions there?
Are we in general Q&A time?
General Q&A time, yes.
So board of advisors for a small company. What would you say would be? It's different than a nonprofit, obviously. It's less altruistic, right? So what would you say would be the pitch or the ask in terms of we're coming to you to ask you to be on the advisors beyond pay, which I think is important, and maybe is $500 enough for a meeting, or does it need to be more? Beyond pay, what would you say the ask needs to include?
And I set up like this.
Well, I think that's a real good question, and I think you need to ask yourself, what are you looking for, right? So if you're looking for some advice on marketing, I think you throw the pitch out there. Look, we're a small company. We've got some challenges on the marketing side. Would you be interested in advising us or being involved in our board for a fee to lend us a hand on some ideas? Maybe it's on the finance side. Maybe you reach out to a CPA in the community and say, you know, we would maybe appreciate some of that business sense as an outside advice.
I think there's a lot of people that would, especially for a small fee, would consider it.
And with any human nature, if you can find a benefit for that person, you know, if they're looking for big clients and you happen to have a couple of those big prospect clients also on your board, they naturally would want to meet them, you know, or whatever
Yeah,
the case.
I'm not quite sure how to answer that, but I'm trying to think back to when I served on a private advisory board. One, I thought, well, that's intriguing. I don't know these people. They're reaching out to me, and again, networking, learning about a diversified holding company and all their different businesses I found intriguing. A little bit of networking. It's like, well, who's the CPA and the attorney and the IT guy that's going to be around the table? I found that intriguing. Good contacts and networking. And maybe a little selfishly in my situation, I said, oh, this is a diversified holding company that has a lot of real estate. They might need some real estate transactions that either me personally or my company can assist with. A little selfish, but hey, business comes around and goes around. All those things piqued my interest, and they paid me to come to meetings, so that was kind of cool.
So with that, Jim, you said you didn't know anything about it. Do you want to talk to people that are familiar with your business? Because every industry or every business runs a little differently. So whether it's a customer or a CPA or a bank, is it wise to get somebody that has at least an understanding how your business operates?
I think it's healthy to get diversity and someone who maybe doesn't even have a clue about your business. And I would say going back a few years when I got more involved, I mentioned venture capital and angel investing type of stuff. Reading business plan after business plan and talking to entrepreneurs, and a guy who has a degree in business and political science, I like to think I'm reasonably well educated. And after all that, I came to the conclusion that, you know, whether we're a nonprofit business or a for-profit business, it's really not that complicated. We have a product or service that we sell up here to try to generate revenue, then we have some expenses, and we try to have a net profit down here. And it really, every one of us has the same challenge. And when it comes to serving on a board, I think it's as simple as that in most cases. Business principles apply to pretty much every one of us in this room here. And as long as you get smart, capable people that I think have some good general business experience and knowledge, I think it's as simple as that in many cases. I don't know, maybe I'm off base on that.
I asked each of these guys to put together a little summary takeaway bullet points. Are you hitting some of those now as we're closing up
I can't
here?
do any better than that. That was my conclusionary comment.
Well, and I think it has to work both ways. I mean, you have to make sure that the person that's willing to serve is going to be, show that the involvement and want to be proactive in being an effective board member. But there are also industries where I think having some knowledge is good. Maybe on more of the business side, it isn't so critical as much as maybe the marketing side. So it really kind of depends on what you're looking for in terms of talent.
So a couple of concluding bullet points. One is, I just wanted, to me, the difference between a not-for-profit organization and a business is a nonprofit as a business. The only difference is how you distribute dividends. Nonprofit reinvest the dividends if you have any profit. I'm talking about more of a commercial kind of operation. You invest back in the business, dividends of other businesses go to the shareholders. And there's nothing wrong with either one of those. And they exist. So I think that leads me to the first bullet, which is purpose. What's the purpose of I think the board's job is what's the purpose of the organization. What I like for a mission of an organization is if we took the particular organization or business off the map this afternoon, why would we put it back in the morning? We took it off the face of the earth, why would you put it back? That's the purpose. You don't know, it's not what you do necessarily, it's why you exist. Strategic, I think boards need to be strategic and really pay attention to that because you want to align with that purpose in that organization. And then the last piece is courageous. Make the kind of decisions that you need to make the kind of investments you need to make, and be good stewards, but be aggressive stewards of what you have and what you've been given and the talents that you have.
And I agree with all of that, and I would just say that I think being involved in a board can be very educational, can be very self-motivating. you're gonna, I think, those of you that have not served on boards, I would encourage you to do it, especially the younger folks in the room. I think you'll learn from it. It's great experiences. There can be some frustrations. There's certainly time commitments. So when you do, agree to serve on a board, be committed. Put your time in, prepare, and you'll grow from it. That's all I got.
Thanks, guys, very much.